אברהם אלוהי יצחק ואלוהי יעקב, האל הגדול הגיבור והנורא, אל עליון גומל חסדים טובים, קונה הכל וזוכר חסדי אבות, ומביא גואל לבני בניהם, למען שמו באהבה, מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן. ברוך אתה אדוני מגן אברהם.
אמן.
אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי מתים אתה רב להושיע, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי מתים ברחמים רבים. סומך נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות, ומי דומה לך, מלך ממית ומחיה, ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה להחיות מתים. ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי המתים. ואתה קדוש יושב תהילות ישראל, קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות, מלוך כל הארץ כבודו.
ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו.
ימלוך אדוני לעולם, אלוהיך ציון, לדור ודור, הללויה.
ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. אמן.
Amen.
Please be seated.
עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. הוא יעשה שלום, הוא יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. הוא יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל.
I would like to call upon Gideon Asher's son, and as he said at a funeral, his favorite son, just like his favorite two daughters, Abigail and Jessica. So I'd like to ask for his favorite son, Gideon, to share his thoughts about his dad.
Thank you, Rabbi. Hope everyone's comfortable. As you all know, Dad was an intellectual heavyweight with an inquiring mind and a thirst for knowledge. He was an accomplished businessman, offering sage advice and leadership to all those he worked with. A witty conversationalist and a strong public speaker, though sadly, he didn't pass that skill on to me. But Dad's number one priority, always, was family, and I'd like to share a few memories with you. The Ashers have lived in different countries and on different continents for a long time. I've lived in a different country from Mum and Dad for over 40 years. But to be honest, it was my father who first suggested that I consider an American university. Yet despite the distances, we remain a very close family. And Dad was the glue that held us together. As most of you know, he was madly and deeply in love with Mum. Bhatia to all of you. You may not know they met at a party. Dad had been invited specifically as a blind date for a French nuclear physicist. On arrival, he immediately worked to impress the prettiest girl in the room, in French, with his considerable charm and intellect. No matter that Mum didn't speak a word of French, or that she knew absolutely nothing about nuclear physics. And so the courtship began. Dad saw what he wanted, and Mum returned his affection. After chatting all evening, Dad accompanied Mum home, a trip that took well over 2 hours, and he asked if they could get together again when he returned from a planned holiday, and they arranged to meet at Tate Britain. True to form, Mum was late. There's always a reason. This time it was that Mum's bus had broken down, and so she arrived over 2 hours late, convinced that Dad would have left. But there he was, sitting outside on the steps of Tate Britain, engrossed in a book, patiently waiting. They were married only 4 months after first meeting, and remained completely devoted to each other for 58 years. Dad often told the story of how they met, but he always added that it was the closest that Mum ever came to being on time. On another occasion, Mum had accepted an invitation to dine at a friend's home. At Dad's insistence, she double-checked the details, especially the time of the invitation. When they knocked, the host answered in his pajamas, and Dad began to wonder what type of party they'd been invited to. It turned out that while Mum had the time and day correct, they were exactly 1 week late. And that was probably the closest that Dad ever came to taking over the diary. Despite his hectic work schedule, Dad always had time for his 3 children. Not only were we each his favourite in a special way, but we know from all of you how often Dad would speak about us with pride and love, which must have been challenging at times because we each experienced periods that might charitably be called rebellious. But he always seemed to know how and when to ignore what other people thought, and he really enjoyed everything about being a father. We were reminiscing earlier about the time Dad received a call whilst he was living in Hong Kong from Abigail's boarding school. The call was intended to tell him that Abigail was about to be expelled. He told them, "My daughter is clearly too creative and interesting for your school. No need for expulsion. I'm coming to get her." And so, suddenly finding himself in a pickle, Dad flew to the UK to charm the headmistress of a London day school. And Abigail continued her education without missing a beat. He was always incredibly supportive. What made our relationships with Dad so special was the obvious joy he took in spending time with and doing unique things for each of us. I remember riding the tube and walking to school every day, standing on his feet. I loved it, so he never complained. Jessica remembers the long handwritten stories he would send her at boarding school, letter by letter, creating chapter after chapter, sent week after week. Detailed characters, elaborate plots. He took such effort and obvious pleasure in making sure each of the stories was a magical read. Abigail remembers his calm voice when she would pull him out of an important business meeting to ask a trivial question, while her client waited impatiently on the other line. He always had time for us, whatever the reason. It didn't matter if we'd messed up, and that included the time difference, which happened far too often. Dad was instantly awake and fully aware, ready to help. He was just as devoted to his grandchildren, creating fantasy worlds they could enjoy together. The first time Kathy and I left Samantha, Emma and Jane in their care, Dad turned the house into the Asher Girls Hotel, Rooms had been renamed, a front desk set up, and Grandad was the first and only guest. He gave the girls a beautiful iridescent bell to use at the front desk, which they promptly broke. Knowing what a wonderful father he was, Abigail and Jessica were incredibly sad that their children, Charlie, Harry and G, never really got to experience their grandfather in the same way, to share their own fantastical make-believe worlds with him. We all know how much he would have enjoyed doing these things with each of them. Dad was not only a great man, but also a devoted, loving husband and an incredible father and grandfather. His life was a remarkable journey, and he always had Mum by his side, sharing, supporting, and enjoying it all with him. To Abigail, Jessica, and me, he is and always will be our hero.
I could ask Ole Kogan to play cello for us. his thoughts about them.
It's a huge privilege and honour for me to have been invited by Bartia and by the family to say a few words about Bernard from the perspective of those who knew him in his work life in Hong Kong and in London. Bernard was different. I first met him in late 1981. I was at that point a young consultant at McKinsey, and I was rung up out of the blue at the office one day by a headhunter wanting to know if I'd be interested in working for what he described as a dynamic Far East-based financial institution as corporate strategist, working for the general manager strategy, who had a remarkable CV and was transforming the way in which the bank went about its business. That was, of course, Bernard. He was my first real boss. He was difficult. He wasn't. He was different from the typical McKinsey partner. In McKinsey, you did strategy by method. You were very focused. There was a strong process. There was a house style. Bernard was much more creative and flexible. He had ideas. He listened to other people's ideas, and then he did the spade work to see if they could be made to work. Bernard had flair. He was different too from the world that he'd invited me into the world of the Hong Kong Bank. The bank, dominant in Hong Kong even now and certainly then, but beginning to look at the wider world, beginning to change its very fixed ways of doing things. Those set ways were embodied in the famous cadre of international officers, a number of whom are here I see today. And the unkind caricature of that ethos of the bank in the 1970s and early 80s, like all such caricatures, partly unfair but not wholly unfair. According to that caricature, you had to be interested in rugby, golf, horse racing. You saw the stock market as something of a casino. You might be interested in sailing, and you went out on the bank junks. And at dinner parties in Hong Kong, you certainly seemed to find yourself endlessly talking about stock market prices and property prices in both Hong Kong and back here in the UK. Bernard was not much interested in any of the above. He, along with a few others, read the Times and even the Guardian at the bank. He was, of course, artistic, cultured, musical, gregarious. He had friends in the Hong Kong media, in the Hong Kong academia, and in the arts world. He was, of course, also an avid participator in those dinner parties, and was always the life and soul of the conversation. He was a delight to work for. He knew about the ways of the world, not least because of his prior experience working at one stage for an American conglomerate, and then, importantly, for the National Economic Development Office, which was a major feature of the British public scene in the 1960s and 1970s. It had, in fact, been set up by the Conservative government in the early 1960s. It was given more clout by the Wilson and then Callaghan administrations in the later 60s and through the 70s. Bernard left it towards the end of that to go to Hong Kong. And thereafter, I note that the National Economic Development Office went into decline. Margaret Thatcher, perhaps predictably, didn't like it, and John Major finally abolished it. But it was highly influential in its time, and Bernard was one of two or three people who were described as consensual industrialists who made a big impact on British public life at that stage. And he brought this wider world to Hong Kong at the beginning of the 1980s, just as the bank was beginning to look to the wider world. The US was the first step in its expansion, and then came the UK and the effort to buy the then rather small Royal Bank of Scotland. Bernard was in the thick of this, as was at least one other person I recognise here today. No sooner had he arrived in Hong Kong, in fact, than he spent most of his time in London and in Edinburgh, shuttling with Frank Frame, who is here, working behind the scenes to advance the bank's case. And that was when I first met him. That was when I responded to that headhunter's call. The merger, the takeover of the Royal Bank of Scotland didn't happen, and as we all know, the Royal Bank of Scotland went down a different path subsequently. Bernard found himself back in Hong Kong on a more stable basis, and it enabled him to spend more time with his family and actually to settle into Hong Kong life, which he enjoyed enormously at the slightly end-of-era atmosphere that was spreading through Hong Kong as the idea of 1997 and the handover was beginning to dawn on everybody. It was, in fact, increasingly aware that it was living on borrowed time. Bernard was, as I say, a delight to work for. He brought an informality to the office and to the role. Crucially, as far as I was concerned, he left me to get on with my job, never breathing down my neck, but always there if air cover was needed. After a while, he was asked by Willie Purvis, the then chairman, to move to a new role, overseeing the work of merchant banking in Hong Kong, the famous Wardley Bank, at a time when it was in a rather fragile condition after one of Hong Kong's repeated boom and bust cycles. And then later he inherited the merchant banking of the wider group, including James Capel and Samuel Montague here in London. I moved on too, to Treasury, and so I was no longer working directly for him, and indeed we both ended up in London in the early 1990s, working in the same building, albeit in different areas. And there was the same informality about Bernard, the same shrewd judgment of people, the same amused sense that so much of that world of markets that we both were involved in one way or another, with its fill of precious individuals and colourful personalities, was so often just one step away from the absurd. I don't remember Bernard ever losing that infectious chuckle of his. He was very serious about his job, but he never seemed to take it too seriously. He certainly never took himself too seriously or gave himself any airs. And yet there was a seriousness of purpose. He believed in the bank, what it was and what it could be. He believed in people. He cared about their development. And as I can personally attest, as an outsider moving into the bank in my early 30s, the big question for me was not, could I do the job I'd been hired for? I had a degree of perhaps overconfidence that I could, but what came next? And Bernard made sure that I got pointed in a sensible direction, as a result of which I stayed. I owe him a huge debt of personal gratitude, and there are many other people I know in the bank who would say the same. Finally, there was one other thing about Bernard at the bank. On the rare occasions when its quixotic ways seemed too difficult to handle even for Bernard, you could always find the conversation turning before very long to his family. It was obvious to all of us who knew him and worked with him how important his family was to him, how proud he was of them, how much he adored his children, and, of course, how much he adored Bhatia, whose effervescent personality gave so much colour to life in Hong Kong and who clearly meant all the world to him. In this, as in so much else, he was an example to us all. May he rest in peace. Amen.
Thank you.
tribute to the life of this remarkable man continues with Psalm 103, which you will find on page 4.
ברכי נפשי את אדוני, וכל קרבי את שם קודשו. ברכי נפשי את אדוני, ואל תשכחי כל גמוליו, הסולח לכל עוונכי, הרופא לכל תחלואיכי, הגואל משחת חייכי, המטרחי חסד ורחמים, המשביע בטוב אדייך, תתחדש כנשר נורייכי, עושה צדקות אדוני ומשפטים לכל עשוקים. יודיע דרכיו למשה, לבני ישראל עלילותיו, רחום וחנון אדוני, ערך אפיים ורב חסד, לא לנצח יריב ולא לעולם יתור, לא חטאינו עשה לנו, ולא עוונותינו גמל עלינו. כי גבוה שמיים על הארץ, גבר חסדו על יראיו, כי רחוק מזרח ממערב, הרחיק ממנו את פשענו.
כרחם אב על בנים רחם אדוני על יראיו, כי הוא ידע יצחקנו, זכור כי עפר אנחנו. אנוש כחציר ימה, כציץ השדה, כן יציץ. כי רוח עוברה בו ואיננו, ולא יכירנו עוד מקומו. בחסד אדוני מעולם ועד עולם עד יראיו, וצדקתו לבני בנים. לשומרי בריתו ולזוכרי פיקודיו לעשותם. אדוני בשמיים הכין כיסו, ומלכותו בכל משלה. ברכו אדוני מלאכיו, גיבורי כוח עושה דברו, לשמוע בכל דברו. ברכו אדוני כל צבאיו, משורתיו עושה רצונו. ברכו אדוני כל מעשיו, בכל מקומות ממשלתו. ברכי נפשי את אדוני. Bless the Lord, all his hosts, his ministers who do his will. Bless the Lord in all places of his dominion. Bless the Lord, O my soul. And I would like to ask for Jenny Barraclough to share her thoughts.
Well, it's not just an honour, but it's the greatest pleasure to talk about Bernard. He was such fun to be with. I don't think there was anyone I preferred to sit next to at a dinner party than Bernard, and everyone felt that way. People were always asking the hostess, could they sit next to Bernard? And but he was so good at every subject you hit on, And he made you feel you were interesting too. You probably weren't, but he made you feel you were. And so that when I discovered he also loved music very much, I was so pleased to invite him to join us as chairman of the Razumovsky, which is an ensemble of some distinction, run by Oleg here, who you've heard play. And it was later that I discovered he absolutely loved the cello, particularly. And his daughter Abigail told me that when she was 8 years old, she had decided she wanted to play the cello, no doubt her father's influence. And he went out, he was in Budapest, he went out one day, he found a shop, must be very hard to do, that sold cello bows. I mean, that's a very specialist thing. Bought the precisely right bow, quarter size for her cello, and brought it back so proudly for her. And I think that's so typical of him. He put that probably before whatever business meeting he had, that he had to get that done. So music was his passion. He loved, I gather, being our chairman, and we were very proud to have him. And he was very generous, because every now and again we might have a very, a large octet or something. It cost an awful lot of money. We wouldn't quite make that in receipts, and he'd just make up the difference. He also had this lovely idea, which he talked about quite often before he got too ill to think about it properly, of having a scholarship, a music scholarship that he would finance for somebody who was a brilliant young musician, but needed that last push to get into the international scene, to be that good that they were playing concerts. And the family have very sweetly said they are going to help sponsor and start a scholarship, which will be a Razumovsky Academy scholarship for a brilliant young student. So I'm really pleased about that, and it will be in Bernard's memory. I think helping young people learn was at the very core of Bernard's being, and my feeling is it must have started because he was the 8th of, or was he the, anyway, he was at the bottom of a long line of children, and his mother died when he was only 8 months old, and his father wasn't there very much. He didn't have a very privileged background at all. He went to a grammar school, but he got himself to the LSE because he was a clever boy. And from then on, he really wanted other people to have this precious gift of a fine education, which he knew had made him what he was, given him all his chances. So when later he became vice chairman of the Board of Governors of the LSE, all the students felt he was on their side, and he did an awful lot for them, and they loved him. And then later on, no, probably actually before, because he had been in Hong Kong before that, he was the governor and chairman of the board of the Chinese International School, which he put a lot of work into. And a couple of students said they would never have got where they got without Bernard on the board. He was the key man for them, a tremendous help to all of them. And one of the co-founders of the school said, although the Chinese International School is non-religious and non-denominational, Bernard saw that we must recognize the spiritual dimension of being human. And I think by that he meant they mustn't just learn about economics and getting high marks and doing well in their grades and getting to be good accountants and bankers. They must study the arts. And he wanted them to learn about poetry and music and literature. He wanted them to have their souls nourished as well. And in fact, throughout his life, he influenced the lives of countless young people. And I think it's a bit like the quotation you see from Buddha in temples, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle. Happiness never decreases by being shared. And he really shared his happiness in the arts. He became, later on, as you probably know, a non-executive director of St George's NHS Hospital Trust. And the people on it said it meant so much to him. He used to talk to his friends about it, and that he navigated the most difficult financial situations for very tricky things would come up, and with calm and goodwill, he'd negotiate his way through them. In fact, he was very, very good with important people and being nice to them, but not being in any way awed by them. And if necessary, putting them in their place. And I heard how when a rather self-important tycoon, bit of a brash young man, put his feet on the table, Bernard said, "Oh, those are such beautiful shoes." I'm so glad you showed them to me, but maybe they look even better on the ground. That's just the sort of thing he would do. And he was even nice and didn't mind when his children called him when he was in the middle of a conference. He would talk to them at any time, apparently. It's amazing how many organisations Bernard gave his time to. I've just got one or two here. The Rheingold Resources, Environmental Investment Organisation, Epoch Software, Lonro Africa, Lion Trust, Legal and General, Morgan Sindel, Gowan Partners, Hansard Global, and that's just a few of them. I think is extraordinary. Despite all that, he gave so much time to the arts. I don't know how he fitted it all in. He passionately loved music. He used words beautifully. He loved poetry. Apparently, when he was taking them to school, he would recite long chunks of poetry to his children. And in their love of beautiful things, he and Batia were such a team. I always remember the joy of going to his home and seeing the beautiful things they'd collected together. Absolutely beautiful. The vases from Hong Kong, the sculptures from Berlin, wonderful things, the murals on the wall in the dining room. They were such a very, very together couple, I thought, the two of them. Absolutely beautiful. But, of course, he was also absolutely determined to do what she wanted when it was her sort of thing, and he wasn't too interested, but he still did it. For instance, when we had board meetings in the kitchen in their house in Montpellier Square, he would offer us coffee, and we'd arrive, harassed and late and longing for our coffee. He'd make the coffee, and we'd look on, kind of expectantly, looking forward to this coffee. He'd say, no, Batia said, 2 minutes brewing, absolutely essential. You have to wait at least 2 minutes. Finally, I just want to tell you what a kind person Bernard was. So kind. Apparently there was a villager in a little village the family had a cottage in, who Bernard didn't know well, but they greeted each other fondly whenever they passed in the street. And this chap lost his job when his factory closed. And he was clearly very, very down. And Bernard made a special trip to visit him in his little house to cheer him up, offer him advice, tell him things he could do to get another job, help him find another job. And similarly, a neighbour of theirs, where they live now, was telling me she was amazed. She went to the post office with him, just nearby, near Gloucester Road Tube Station probably. Everybody knew him, so presumably he chatted to people, and they just felt his warmth. And I thought one of the most touching things I've heard, Batia was telling me that when he died, his carers were so deeply, deeply upset, and they'd become so fond of him, and they had only known him when he was no longer able to communicate. I find that just amazing, because somehow he exuded warmth and love, and they became deeply, deeply fond of him. And you could think it was the most thankless job anyone could have, what they were doing, but no, they loved him dearly. And I thought that was very telling. So, looking back at the totality of his life, I so agree with a journalist friend who said, how did Bernard fit it all in? I just don't know. I mean, when I think that he could hold in his mind, in a short space of time, an economic policy statement, a cello concerto, a quote from The Wasteland, anything, all there in this beautiful mind. And there's one quotation that keeps coming into my mind. It's what Ophelia said of Hamlet. And I think it makes me very sad, this. She said of Hamlet, oh, what a mind is here o'erthrown. Isn't that beautiful? Oh, what a mind is here overthrown. We can only imagine the pain that Batia and her 3 lovely children are suffering. But I wonder if I could just read them this beautiful quote by a Native American chief who said, when your time comes to die, be not like those whose hearts are filled with fear of death. Sing your death song and die like a hero going home. It's lovely that Gideon mentioned him being a hero, because he's a hero who has now gone home. In his quiet way, I think we all feel he was a bit of our hero, and we'll all miss him very, very much.
Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. Please join in. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Abigail, please come and share your thoughts.
My father was one of life's brightest shining stars. His wit and humour were infectious. It always seemed, if needed, that he could make any situation divinely funny, and everything we did together with him always seemed like a wonderful adventure that we never wanted to end. We treasure the memories as children, standing together in the riverbed in his beloved Suffolk at the bottom of our garden, the mud squishing between our toes, the water rippling over our bare feet, as he created a magical world of storytelling and fantasy all around us. As a young family, we would often go on long car trips through Europe, and he would make such an effort to create excitement before we left. He always made it feel as if we were embarking on the journey of a lifetime. Each trip began the same way, with him playing the identical piece of music, which of course by the fifth trip we knew by heart, Tchaikovsky's Little Russian. He played it almost like a prelude of anticipation, and we would all squeal with delight as it began, and he would rev up the engine of the car. Sometimes during these trips, when the traffic was really slow, he would encourage us to stop pedaling our feet on the floor, telling us that it might actually help make the car speed up. It was a testament to him and everything that he did, that he would always try and make each and every experience so very special. Our family has been truly touched these past 2 weeks by all the letters we've received that referenced so many of the qualities that we, his family, held dear. Reading about the impact my father had on so many people, who spoke of how he shared his wisdom with such humility and gave his advice, guidance, and counsel with such integrity, with his blend of sanguine clarity and calm, has been truly uplifting. We knew him as a man of deep empathy and kindness, always in pursuit of truth and beauty, special, special qualities for a man that inhabited the worlds that he did. My father didn't have much parental structure growing up. He was raised by his older siblings, and there were no parents as role models providing him with guidance and support. And maybe that's why it gave him great satisfaction over the years to be there for others in so many different capacities. I always think it was a result of his upbringing that he approached everything he did with such a sense of responsibility and deliberation. We, his children, always felt so incredibly safe when we were with him, or he was giving us his advice. As many of you here know, my father had a passion for reading. The range of books in his library were a true reflection of who he was. From poetry to religion, economics to music, art to science, history to horticulture, and literature through the centuries, all read until the pages were worn. I remember like it was yesterday, watching my father in awe as he dried flowers all over the house, handwriting their Latin names on note cards. Flowers he would then sprinkle haphazardly throughout his books like memento bookmarks. Many months or even years later, when I would take a book off the shelf, I would happen upon one of these dried flowers like a surprise gift, and it would always make the experience that much more special. As his illness took away his ability to read, that seemed especially harsh. It is cruel and ironic that it was dementia that stole these past 8-9 years from him and from us, as his brilliant analytical mind and his magical use of language was central to his very being. My mother and sister Jessica were always by his side during this long and heartbreaking illness, supporting him every day. I know that for them particularly, his losing the ability to be able to communicate and speak when language was so precious to him was especially painful. We are so lucky to have had you in our lives, Daddy, to have been a part of your dazzling journey. We will miss you forever.
Your presence here tonight, the beautiful music which we have heard and will still hear, are a real tribute to the life of this hugely remarkable man. He was a friend, he was a husband, a father, a businessman, someone who loved life and what life was able to offer. He believed in the physical as well as the spiritual. He was always an absolute delight. When I was walking just outside the synagogue and I met Bernard Asher on the street, greeting me with his beautiful smile and beautiful welcome. And of course it was an amazing treat when he invited me to his house to see the books, the art, and admire and learn and be with him as an individual. Today, when we are witnessing the cruelty of the world in which we live, when people still murder because they want others to believe in the same thing as they do, Bernard Asher was the man of universality, of an understanding that we all have to work together in order to make the world in which we live a better one. He was, as we heard from the tributes, interested in really everything that life can and could offer. He was interested in religion. He was broad-minded. He was, and he had an intellect, and an eternal optimist he was. He cared about community, about faith and spirituality. He was never dogmatic. He was always open. When he lived in the place in Suffolk, there was no synagogue. So instead he became very friendly with the local vicar. And I'm told by his children, when Daddy walked into the church, the face of the vicar would light up. They would, in fact, go to church and then enjoy together country pub as a family afterwards. Bernard was a member of this community, a faithful member together with Batya and their children, because he believed in the openness that this particular place can offer and does offer. Because there is only one God. And we, human beings, whoever we are, whatever color, religion, nationality, we are all children of God. And so whether one goes to synagogue or to church or to mosque, we pray for a better world. And it was interesting for Jenny Barraclough to mention a quote from Buddha, because it is actually his birthday in the next few days. The man who taught and was brilliant, and whose thoughts are not that dissimilar to the thoughts and teachings of the ethics of our fathers, Pirkei Avot. You can see the similarities. You can see the way that things really should be working. I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight to celebrate and to remember this remarkable man. And to be with the family, to support them in their times of sadness and sorrow. Bernard, you shall be missed. Your place in this synagogue and in the hearts of your family and friends will always leave a gap that we will always try to fill by remembering your goodness, your kindness, your generosity, your skill, and your mind. May you rest in peace. Amen. Would you please rise? El Male Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hametzeh Menucha Nekona, Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, B'mahalot, Kedoshim Utehorim, Kezohar Rakia Mashirim, Et Nishmat Baruch, Shalach Leolamo, Hanal Barachamim, Hastirehu Beseder Knafecha, Leolamim, Otzeror, Betror, Achaim et Nishmato, Adonai Unachalato, Ve'yanuach, B'shalom al mishkavo, V'nomar, Amen. O God, full of compassion, who dwellest on high, grant perfect rest beneath the shelter of your presence among the exalted and holy and pure who shine like the light of the firmament, to Bernard Asher, who has gone to his eternal home. We beseech thee, O Lord of compassion, shelter his forever under the cover of thy wings, and bind his soul in the bond of life. The Lord is his inheritance, may he be at peace in his place of rest. And let us say, Amen. Amen. And let us say together the mourner's catch. Yitgadal, Yitkadash, Shemei Rabbah. Ve'alma dibrach Yirutei Yamlich Malkutei. V'chayechon u'b'yomechon u'v'chaye b'chol Beit Yisrael. V'gala b'zman kariv imru amen. יהא שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעד מעלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתהלל ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילם עם כל ברכתה ושירתה. תשבחתה ונחמתה. תאמירם בעלמא אמרו אמן. יהא שלמה רבה מן שמיה. וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל אמרו אמן. עושה שלום בברכה. We ask Shalom, Aleinu Bi'al Kol Yisrael. And before we go downstairs, where you're cordially invited to join us to really celebrate with food and drink and remember and recall the memory, please, just for a moment, just sit down and let us think of Bernard Asher the way that we remember him and we wish to remember him. Because it is through remembrance that we will keep his life eternal.